Hello, my name is Rob, and today I will look at forest, fires, and biodiversity. There are several politicians that are using the risk of forest fires to avoid biodiversity targets or improving biodiversity. And I will look at some of those. They range from Donald Trump to Danielle Smith in Alberta, and even Democratic politicians are not immune to inaccurate findings on biodiversity or reducing fire risk. The first article that I have is from Politico. It's called "Trump Blames California for Wildfires, Tells State You Gotta Clean Your Floors." And Donald Trump seemed to be promoting logging as a way to reduce forest fires. But as I will get into, that is going to make things worse. And did I highlight anything in this article? I don't think I highlighted anything. Climate change is increasing the risk of forest fires as well. And Donald Trump's policies are adding to the forest fires. There was a radio show called Your Province, Your Premier. And on April 18th, Danielle Smith talked about backing away from biodiversity targets, citing increased risk of forest fires, and rejected biodiversity commitments because of that. And this is at the 15-minute mark. And Danielle Smith is the Premier of Alberta. And she said some landscapes have to be managed, meaning logging or some other management. And then British Columbia is also backing or considering backing away from the biodiversity targets from the federal government. There was an article in the Norwell newspaper called "Creative Math or Conservation Loophole. BC rethinks 30 by 30 after industry push." And this was made March 30th, 2026. And there's the Association for the Mineral Exploration, British Columbia. I'm just going to ignore the phone call for now. And yeah, the article talks about lobbying and that there's a definition from the lobbying industry. And then there's a quote from the minister. Many of the so-called protected areas cited in the association's policy paper do not restrict all resource activities that can negatively affect biodiversity. And Torrance Coast, Associate Director of the Wilderness Committee, said that Minister Neal's statement was encouraging at the time, but Stone's comments and more recent statements by the ministry have left him worried. Stone is the Association of the Mineral Exploration Executive Officer. And some of the land designations included in the Association for Mineral Exploration's policy proposal are old growth management areas. And these are areas that are actively logged, but they're considered. The government is considering them as protected areas, which doesn't make sense. And let's talk about it not meeting the International Union for Conservation and Nature guidelines. So that's that article. And then I looked at an article from Ecosphere. Does increased forest protection correspond to higher forest fire or higher fire severity in frequent fire forest of the United States? And that's by Curtis Bradley, Chad Hansen, and Dominic Delasal. And I looked at the discussion. They found no evidence to support the prevailing forest fire management hypothesis that higher levels of forest protections are associated with more severe fires. And using over 3 decades of fire severity data from the relatively frequent fire pine and mixed conifer forest throughout the western United States, we found support for the opposite conclusion. Burn severity tended to be higher in areas with lower levels of protection status, bracket, more intense management, end bracket. So that means logging. After accounting for topographical and climate considerations in all 3 model runs. So there's evidence that logging increases the risk of forest fires. Then I have another article. Alberta rejects federal nature strategy, redefines protected land in CBC. Canada is announced plans to protect 30% of its lands by 2030, which is 30 by 30. And Alberta is saying that 60% of its lands are protected, even though some of that land includes commercial forestry, oil and gas exploration, and mining. I looked at an article from the David Suzuki Foundation, and this article is, Will Logging More in Healthy Forests Reduce Wildfire Risk? And from the article, decades of clear-cut logging, conifer planting, and extensive fire suppression have more likely exacerbated fire risk to communities than diminished it. And even though there's a large amount of biomass, there's shade and moisture retention from multi-layered closed canopies in older forest can reduce fire risk, and that's from the article. Old growth forests exist because they grow on wetter, cooler sites that have been naturally spared from wildfire, and younger forests are also at risk of burning. That makes sense because of the earlier statement that trees retain moisture. And wildfires can remove sick and dying vegetation, stimulate natural regeneration, and support biodiversity. And then finally, there's an opinion in PNAS by Della Sala, Boomer, and Levikas, as well as Bolton. Removing dead trees will not save us from fast-moving wildfires. And I made some highlights. There was little evidence that removing dead trees en masse is an effective strategy to contain fast fires. In fact, a substantial body of evidence shows that such large-scale tree removals will have cumulative and mostly negative ecosystem and climate consequences, emitting vast quantities of carbon from commercial logging activities and increasing the risk of fires and floods. And then there's flawed approach. Many recent fires occurred away from forest. Removing dead trees would have done little to prevent a recent spate of intense fires. And then they spread mostly from non-forested environments. There's also vague language which addresses logging provisions in the U.S. fire policies can in effect be used to permit the removal of any trees showing burn effects, including live but somewhat scorched crowns that are capable of surviving. And then there's another highlight. Many trees, such as eucalyptus, some conifers, and Mediterranean shrubs, are equally flammable, whether dead or alive, under extreme fire weather conditions. And dead trees that have lost their foliage are much less likely to sustain flaming in the fire front. And then post-fire flush of herbaceous colonizers, grasses, and shrubs contribute to the fire spread. And this increases after logging. And that makes sense because of the succession. So they're saying that new arrivals are more likely to increase forest fires. And they also say that removing down dead trees can reduce forest fires, but it only applies if the fine fuels such as branches, needles, and twigs are removed. And they say that this is rare in salvage operations that leave behind large amount of fine fuels as highly flammable logging slash. And did I highlight anything else? But this This demonstrates that several politicians are incorrect when they say that biodiversity leads to increased forest fires. There are studies and opinion pieces that demonstrate that forest fires are reduced when we increase biodiversity. There are ways to reduce the fire risk, including controlled burns, but logging is not a way to reduce. Clear-cut logging is not a way to reduce forest fires in a way that many politicians seem to imply. So when you hear a statement from a politician, it's important to look at the scientific literature and other supporting evidence. Because when the politicians have misleading information, it leads to negative consequences. In this case, increased risk of forest fires. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you have a good rest of your day.